So imagine buying like the ultimate guaranteed guide to building immense personal wealth.
Yeah.
You sit down, you read every chapter, you absorb the philosophy, and you follow every single rule to the absolute letter. You ensure your income, you ruthlessly cut your expenses, you invest your surplus. You just do everything this foundational common sense manual tells you to do. And then exactly 24 months after the book hits the shelves, the entire global economy just vaporizes.
Yeah, you're left holding this book of, financial parables while the stock market crashes by like 90%.
Exactly.
Unemployment spikes to 25%, and the banks literally close their doors.
It's wild. That is the exact historical irony of George S. Classen's 1927 classic, The Richest Man in Babylon. It was published right on the precipice of the Great Depression.
Talk about bad timing.
Right. Yet despite that catastrophic timing, if you type how to save money into a search engine today, or if you ask a financially successful relative for advice, they will inevitably hand you a copy of this book.
Oh, yeah. It is universally treated as the holy grail of personal finance. I mean, it's basically the foundational text for the entire modern hustle and invest culture.
It really is.
Yeah.
But the reason we are diving into this today is because of a fascinating critique we came across. We are looking at a deep dive book review written by a Substack author who goes by the handle Gigabyte Spider.
It's a great handle.
It is.
Yep.
And this reviewer is not just offering like a casual opinion on a vintage book. They are systematically attempting to dismantle the entire premise of The Richest Man in Babylon.
Yeah, they really tear it apart.
They do. They're arguing that the timeless advice we've all been fed is actually broken, like entirely hollow and fundamentally inapplicable to the modern world.
And I think what makes this review so compelling to dissect is the specific analytical lens the author uses. They aren't just saying, times are tough right now.
No, it's way deeper than that.
Exactly. They are using a very specific socioeconomic and political framework to diagnose the problem. The reviewer explicitly traces the breakdown of this financial advice back to the economic policies of the Ronald Reagan era.
Right.
They dig into concepts like the deliberate hoarding of wealth by the upper classes, the demonization of socialist programs, and the structural rigging of the modern economy.
Which means we really need to set the parameters for our discussion right now.
Yeah, that's important.
When you examine economic critiques like this, it's very easy to get derailed into an ideological debate. I want to make this super clear for you listening. Whether you personally agree with the reviewer's political stance on the 1980s or wealth redistribution, the underlying economic mechanisms they're pointing out are what we want to tear apart today.
Right. Our job here isn't to endorse a political viewpoint.
Exactly. We are absolutely not taking a side on whether these historical shifts were morally good or bad. We are going to faithfully map the logic this reviewer uses to deconstruct a century-old financial giant. We want to look at the how and the why behind their claims.
And to do that effectively, we have to start by understanding the target of the critique. You mentioned the historical irony of 1927 earlier.
Yeah.
The context of how The Richest Man in Babylon actually came into existence is vital to understanding why the reviewer thinks it fails today. I mean, this wasn't written as a cohesive economic treatise by a university professor.
Right, it started as pamphlets, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. Back in the 1920s, George Clason was actually a map maker and a publisher. He just started writing these short, punchy financial parables set in ancient Babylon.
Okay, so just short stories, basically.
Yeah, he would print them as pamphlets, and then banks and insurance companies would buy them in bulk and hand them out to their customers.
Oh, wow. So it was basically 1920s content marketing.
That's exactly what it was.
The banks were handing out pamphlets that told people, hey, the secret to wealth is saving your money and investing it. Which, coincidentally meant depositing it right back into the very banks handing out the pamphlets.
Yeah, it was a highly effective distribution model. And in 1927, Clason compiled the most popular of these pamphlets into the book we know today.
Makes sense.
And the reviewer actually gives Clason some credit here. They note that the parables themselves, the stories of chariot builders and money lenders in ancient Mesopotamia, are genuinely engaging.
It is a fun read, honestly.
It is. The reviewer even concedes that on a purely theoretical level, the base economic strategy is, quote, partly solid.
I mean, looking at the 3 core rules the book lays out, calling them partly solid almost feels like an understatement when you view them in a vacuum.
Right, they're very logical.
The rules are incredibly straightforward. Rule number 1, ensure an income. You need a trade or a job. Rule number 2, deny procrastination.
Just do the work.
Exactly. Be disciplined, live below your means, and pay your debts. And then rule number 3, invest the surplus. Take whatever is left over and put it to work so it earns interest.
Yeah. Get a job, don't be lazy, invest the rest. On a purely mathematical level, if you have income, keep expenses low, and generate compound interest, wealth will accumulate. It's the basic physics of finance.
Right. But the analogy that keeps coming to mind as I read this reviewer's critique is a fitness guru standing on a stage.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Imagine a guy with six-pack abs telling an auditorium, hey, if you want to be healthy, the secret is incredibly simple. Just eat less and move more.
Yes, it's the exact same dynamic.
Right. Because biologically speaking, eat less, move more is a partly solid baseline strategy. You cannot argue with the thermodynamics of a caloric deficit.
You literally can't.
But as actual actionable advice for a real person, it is almost entirely useless because it completely ignores real-world friction.
Right.
It ignores the person living in a food desert where a head of lettuce costs $5 and takes a 2-hour bus ride to get.
Yeah.
It ignores the single parent working 3 gig economy jobs who physically does not have the time to meal prep or hit the gym.
Yeah.
The advice is technically true, but human beings do not live in a technical vacuum.
That friction is the absolute cornerstone of the reviewer's argument. The advice in The Richest Man in Babylon was written inside a very specific historical and socioeconomic bubble.
The 1920s.
Exactly. The 1920s, post-World War I America, was an era of unprecedented industrial expansion and relative economic stability. There was this prevailing cultural belief that the economic pie was simply going to expand forever.
Yeah, it's easy to write a book telling people to just invest their surplus when the stock market is inflating by the minute and anyone throwing a dart at a board is making a return.
Completely. But the reviewer uses the 1929 crash to prove a really important structural point.
Yeah.
Individual financial discipline cannot always outmaneuver macroeconomic reality.
Wow. Yeah.
If you were a diligent reader in 1927, you could have followed all 3 of Klessen's rules flawlessly.
You did everything right. You worked hard, you didn't procrastinate, you bought stocks with your surplus, and yet your wealth still evaporated overnight.
Right.
Why? Because the system surrounding your individual choices collapsed. The reviewer's core thesis is that Clason's advice is hollow because it pretends the individual exists completely independent of the system.
So, if the system matters more than the individual advice, we have to figure out what makes the system work. And the reviewer argues there's an invisible foundation that the entire Babylonian philosophy rests on.
Yes.
If Clason's advice is an engine that turns your labor into wealth, the reviewer claims that engine requires a very specific type of fuel. They call that fuel trust.
I found this to be the most compelling analytical leap in the entire review.
Same.
We usually think of the economy purely in terms of currency, goods, and services. But the reviewer frames the economy as a web of social contracts. They argue that the richest man in Babylon relies on 3 massive, entirely unspoken assumptions about societal trust.
If these 3 assumptions aren't actively operating in the real world, the advice mathematically cannot function.
Let's pull these apart because this moves us from philosophical critique to actual mechanics.
Yeah.
What is the first layer of trust the book assumes is just naturally present?
So the first assumption is that moneylenders will treat borrowers fairly and offer realistic goals for repayment.
Okay.
The book assumes that the debt structure of society is designed to allow individuals to eventually pay off what they owe and achieve independence, rather than trapping them in perpetual servitude.
Well, that makes sense in the context of a parable, I guess.
Right.
The wise old lender gives the young protagonist a loan to start a chariot business with a reasonable interest rate so the kid can succeed.
Right, a nice, neat story.
But obviously, modern payday loans charging 400% APR or credit card companies relying on minimum payments to keep you in debt for 30 years, they don't exactly fit that Babylonian ideal.
Not at all. Which leads directly into the reviewer's second unspoken assumption. The book trusts that society will actually provide the income necessary for a borrower to realistically pay back their debt in the first place.
Meaning wages.
Wages, yes. The assumption that the compensation for human labor will fundamentally keep pace with the cost of basic survival and the cost of capital.
Right.
If a day's labor cannot buy a day's bread, let alone service a debt, the first rule in sure an income is broken right out of the gate.
And if you can't pay the debt, the lender, from assumption 1, doesn't get their money back. I'm starting to see how these are interlocked. What's the third assumption?
The third assumption ties it all together into a macroeconomic cycle. The reviewer states the book assumes the wealthy will willingly part with their money for a fair price or service.
Okay, so spending.
Yes. In other words, there is a continuous, healthy, and reciprocal flow of capital. The rich buy services from the working class, paying them fair wages. The working class uses those wages to buy, gling, and pay back loans from the rich, and the cycle continues.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of anyone listening who has, like, an entrepreneurial mindset.
Go for it.
When I hear the reviewer complain about a lack of trust or demand a fair game, my immediate reaction is to push back. Isn't taking out a loan inherently a risk? By definition, capital investment is a gamble on the future.
It is.
The lender risks their capital, the borrower risks their labor. Why does the reviewer frame this specific type of societal trust, this guarantee of cyclical fairness, as an absolute prerequisite for basic financial mobility? Hasn't commerce always been a bit ruthless?
It's a crucial pushback. We really shouldn't confuse trust with a lack of risk. The reviewer isn't suggesting that loans should be guaranteed or that businesses shouldn't be allowed to fail.
Right.
What they are pointing out is the difference between a symbiotic ecosystem and an extractive one.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. I need a visual.
Sure. Think of the economy like a forest ecosystem. Predators eat prey. That's the risk. That's the ruthlessness of the market.
Right. It's brutal but natural.
Exactly. But in a healthy symbiotic ecosystem, the predators don't consume the prey faster than the prey can reproduce. If they do, the prey goes extinct, and then the predators starve to death.
The system breaks down.
Right. The system relies on a balance. The reviewer is pointing out that Clausen's Babylonian parables assume an economy where the wealthy, the lenders and employers, understand they need a healthy, solvent working class to keep the economy moving.
Oh, so it's like the famous Henry Ford concept.
Yeah.
Ford paid his factory workers a significantly higher wage than the industry standard.
Yes.
Not out of the goodness of his heart, but because he realized that if his own workers couldn't afford to buy the cars they were building, he wouldn't have a customer base.
That is the exact mechanism of the third assumption. Ford was willing to part with his capital paying higher wages to fuel the circulatory system of the economy.
I see.
The reviewer is arguing that the common sense investing advice of 1927 only works when capital flows in both directions. If the rules are structured so that capital only flows upward and wages are suppressed below the cost of living, then advising someone to invest your surplus is mathematically absurd. The debt required just to survive will always consume the surplus before it can be invested.
The water level is rising, and the book is just telling people to swim harder.
And that transitions us into the historical pivot of the review. The author doesn't just state that this symbiotic trust has vanished into thin air. They point to specific policy eras and structural changes that systematically dismantled it.
Right, and this is where the reviewer's specific political lens comes into sharp focus. They draw a hard line in the sand, pointing specifically to the economic policies inherited from Ronald Reagan's presidency in the 1980s.
Yeah.
They see that era as the catalyst for today's widening wealth gap and the destruction of this Babylonian trust. And again, just to remind you, we're just exploring the reviewer's argument here, not validating the politics.
Absolutely. So, sticking to the reviewer's logic, they explicitly link this era to a fundamental shift in how the wealthy view the working class. They argue that prior to these policy shifts, there was at least a functional reliance between the classes.
Okay.
But post-1980s, according to the text, the wealthy no longer trust the non-rich to pay off any borrowed debt.
No longer trust the non-rich. It frames the wealth gap not just as an outcome of different business strategies, but as a proactive defensive posture by the upper class.
It really does.
It's like the wealthy looking at the working class and essentially labeling them a subprime investment.
It's a profound mechanical shift. Think about it. If you are a lender or an employer and you determine that the middle and lower classes are incapable of generating enough value to reliably pay back debt, you stop investing in them.
Right.
You stop building factories that require middle-class labor. You stop offering favorable loan terms. You shift your capital away from the cyclical economy entirely.
And the reviewer notes that this loss of trust isn't just about individual mortgages or credit cards either. It extends to the macro level.
Yes.
The text states that the wealthy also distrust debt incurred by the government through what the reviewer terms socialist programs, meaning social safety nets, infrastructure spending, or public education programs meant to benefit the vast majority of the populace.
Let's break down the mechanics of why that happens. If you fundamentally believe the working class cannot generate a return on investment, then any government program that taxes your wealth to subsidize the working class is viewed as capital destruction.
You view it as pouring money down a drain.
Therefore, the logical, albeit cynical, response is to insulate your wealth from the system entirely.
Which brings us to the specific tools the reviewer claims the wealthy use to create this insulation. The text argues that because of this fundamental breakdown in societal trust, the capital class actively fought for 3 specific systemic advantages.
Okay, what are they?
Tax breaks, stagnating wages, and the highly accelerated adoption of artificial intelligence.
We really need to look at how these 3 elements function mechanically to break Klassen's rules. Let's start with tax breaks.
Sure.
If the wealthy successfully lobby to significantly lower their tax burden, especially on capital gains versus income, they are mechanically starving the state's ability to fund those social safety nets the reviewer mentioned.
It's the monopoly analogy. Think about a standard game of Monopoly. Everyone gets $200 when they pass go. You buy properties, you pay rent, the money circulates.
Right.
It's a brutal game, but there's a cycle. Now imagine a game where one player acquires Boardwalk, Park Place, and all the railroads.
They basically hold the vast majority of the capital.
But instead of continuing to play by the original rules, that player uses their leverage to change the mechanics of the board. They declare that they no longer have to pay taxes on the luxury tax square.
Yeah.
They decree that the amount the other players receive for passing go is permanently frozen at $200, even as the rent on Boardwalk skyrockets to $2,000.
That's the wage stagnation element right there. Corporate profits completely decouple from worker compensation. The value of the labor is being captured entirely by the property owner, and it's not being shared with the worker.
Right. And then, for the final blow, the dominant player decides they don't even want to interact with the other players anymore. They replace the other players' tokens with automated algorithms that pay rent directly to the bank without drawing a salary.
The adoption of artificial intelligence.
Exactly. And while all of this is happening, someone is standing next to the Monopoly board, reading from The Richest Man in Babylon.
Just reading the rules of a different game.
Telling the players who are desperately mortgaging their Baltic Avenue just to pay a single turn of rent, hey, you just need to deny procrastination and invest your surplus. The advice is completely divorced from the new mechanics of the game.
The way you layered that analogy perfectly highlights the reviewer's cause and effect logic. The reviewer categorizes tax breaks, wage stagnation, and AI not as separate, unavoidable macroeconomic weather events, but as a coordinated paranoid hoarding of wealth.
Why use the word paranoid, though? I mean, it's a strong word.
Because if the wealthy fundamentally distrust the stability of the system, if they believe the working class is insolvent and the government is inefficient, they will hoard capital defensively.
Right.
They extract value from the labor market, but refuse to re-inject it. And when we look at the third tool, artificial intelligence, we see the complete severing of Classen's very first rule.
Rule 1, ensure an income.
Yes. For a century, capital needed labor to multiply. A factory owner needed humans to assemble the widgets. There was a baseline requirement to ensure some income for the masses.
You had to pay people to make the things.
But if human labor is aggressively replaced by AI because the capital class views algorithms as a more reliable, cheaper, and fundamentally more trustworthy investment than human beings, then how do you ensure an income?
You can't. If the mechanism for converting your time into money is removed from the board, step 1 of the Babylonian formula is physically impossible.
And if step 1 is compromised, step 3, investing the surplus, becomes a mathematical fantasy. This brings us to the most visceral part of the reviewer's critique, what they call the death of the surplus.
The reviewer paints a genuinely bleak picture of the modern middle and lower classes. They argue that a confluence of these socioeconomic factors has made it nearly impossible to ascend the economic ladder or even afford basic necessities.
That's rough.
And the list of soaring costs they provide is going to trigger some financial anxiety for anyone listening.
The text specifically cites food, which is growing increasingly expensive due to fragile supply chain issues. It cites housing, which is out of reach due to a severe lack of availability. It also lists healthcare, transportation, and utilities as crippling burdens on the modern worker.
Let's talk about the mechanics of why these specific costs are rising, because it ties directly back to the reviewer's point about hoarding. Take housing, for example. It's not just that the population is growing. It's that institutional investors, private equity firms, the very people who have aggregated massive amounts of capital through the tax breaks and wage stagnation we discussed, are now using that hoarded capital to buy up single-family homes.
Yes. They are outbidding individual families with cash offers, essentially turning a generation of potential homeowners into permanent renters.
So the working class is locked out of the primary mechanism for building generational wealth property ownership. And instead, a larger percentage of their stagnant wage goes toward paying rent to the capital class. The surplus is being actively extracted.
The exact same logic applies to healthcare and transportation. These aren't luxury goods.
No.
You cannot simply deny procrastination and choose not to need insulin, or choose not to heat your home in the winter, or choose not to repair your car to get to work.
You have to pay those costs.
The reviewer is stating a stark mathematical reality, because the costs of absolute non-negotiable necessities consume the entirety of a stagnant wage. Taking financial risks to grow wealth becomes impossible. You cannot invest a surplus that does not exist.
I want to really dig into the philosophical implication of this because it challenges the absolute bedrock of the American dream.
It does.
The entire premise of Western economic mobility, and certainly the premise of the Babylonian parables, is that you can start from nothing. You start with a net worth of $0, you secure a trade, you save a few coppers a week, and eventually you become the richest man in Babylon. Zero is supposed to be the starting line.
But the reviewer is arguing that in the modern economy, $0 is no longer a starting line. It is an inescapable trap.
How did the math on that work? Why is zero a trap now if it wasn't in 1927?
The reviewer explicitly points out that starting at zero today is highly unlikely to lead to success because basic life necessities must be bought out of pocket by the consumer at highly inflated privatized rates. Let's look at the mechanics. If you enter adulthood with a net worth of zero, but you require shelter, food, transportation, and healthcare just to be physically capable of working a job, and those costs exceed your entry-level wage, you'd immediately go into the negative.
You have to take on debt just to survive the first month.
Exactly. You use a credit card for groceries. You take a high-interest auto loan because public transit is gutted. You go into student debt because a degree is gatekept as a basic requirement for a livable wage. You are not starting at zero. You are starting at negative $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000.
Wow.
The math is structurally rigged against the starting line. You spend the first 2 decades of your working life just trying to reach zero.
So the surplus isn't just dead, it's aggressively negative. And this brings us to a fascinating macroeconomic consequence that the reviewer highlights. We talked earlier about how the wealthy lost trust in the working class's ability to repay debt. How does the death of the surplus impact the lenders themselves?
Well, it creates a feedback loop of economic stagnation. The reviewer points out that this widespread inability to save actually degrades the confidence of the financial institutions giving out loans.
Because if nobody has a surplus, any disruption, like a medical emergency, a car breaking down, a global pandemic, means immediate default.
Precisely. The lenders look at the data. They see that wages are flat, costs are soaring, and consumers are maxed out on credit just buying groceries. The lender realizes the borrower has zero margin for error.
Right.
So what does the lender do? They tighten their belts. They increase interest rates to offset the higher risk of default. They require higher down payments. They deny loans to the people who need capital the most to start small businesses or buy homes.
Which chokes off economic mobility even further. It's a completely vicious cycle. The wealthy hoard capital because they view the working class as a bad risk. The working class becomes a bad risk because their wages are stagnant and their costs are artificially inflated by the wealthy hoarding assets like housing. Because the working class is struggling, the wealthy tighten the lending requirements even more. The gears of the Babylonian machine grind to an absolute halt.
It is systemic gridlock. And this leads us to the final and I think most historically profound critique the reviewer makes about the richest man in Babylon.
The history part, right?
The author asks a vital question. Why did this advice seemingly work in the actual historical ancient Mesopotamia? Why did Clayson feel comfortable using Babylon as the ultimate example of personal wealth building? The answer the reviewer provides shatters the libertarian fantasy of the book. It all comes down to the role of the state.
This blew my mind when I read the source material. We always picture these ancient parables as taking place in a pure, unregulated free market. Just a bunch of merchants haggling in a dusty bazaar where the smartest and most disciplined individual wins.
It's a highly romanticized, completely historically inaccurate projection of 1920s capitalism onto the ancient world. The reviewer points out a massive historical oversight by Clayson. In actual historical Babylon, the state played an incredibly active, integral part in wealth distribution. The economy was heavily centrally managed.
Explain how that worked, because the book makes it seem like the government was just a backdrop.
Far from it. Ancient Mesopotamian economies were heavily agricultural, and loans were often made in barley or silver. If a farmer took out a loan for seed in the spring and a drought wiped out his crop, the debt didn't just disappear.
The bank still wants their money.
Right. The interest, which was often astronomically high, sometimes 20 or 30% compounded, the farmer would lose his land to the wealthy lender, then he would have to sell his servants, then his children, then himself into debt bondage.
Which sounds exactly like the vicious cycle of extractive capitalism we just described.
Yeah.
So how did society survive that?
State intervention. The Babylonian kings understood that if the wealthy lenders foreclosed on all the land and enslaved all the farmers, the state would collapse. Who would grow the food? Who would fight in the king's army?
Right, a society of debt slaves cannot defend a border.
So, to prevent systemic collapse, the state would periodically institute what were called debt jubilees.
They would literally cancel the debt.
They would wipe the slate clean. A new king would take the throne and issue an edict. All agrarian debts are canceled, all indentured servants are freed, and all foreclosed land is returned to its original owners. It was a massive, state-mandated reset of the economy to prevent private greed from cannibalizing the society.
So the reviewer is saying that George Clason cherry-picked the aesthetic of Babylon, the gold coins, the silk robes, the individual merchants, without acknowledging the massive, heavy-handed governmental mechanics that actually kept Babylonian society functioning.
Yes.
Clason ignored the fact that the state actively acted as a counterbalance to private hoarding.
Exactly. And the reviewer uses this historical reality to draw a razor-sharp contrast with modern times. The text makes a very specific, carefully worded note here. The reviewer acknowledges that today we live in a country where slavery is abolished, which is obviously the greatest moral and human advancement.
Right, we aren't literally selling our children to cover a bad harvest.
But the reviewer notes that because of this, combined with the policy shifts we discussed, the modern wealthy class has achieved a level of economic independence from governmental influence that ancient lenders never had.
I want to really unpack the phrase financial independence because it is the ultimate buzzword in modern finance. If you read any blog, buy any course, or read The Richest Man in Babylon, the goal is always financial independence.
Oh, yeah.
It usually means having enough passive income that you don't have to work a 9-to-5 job. But the reviewer is twisting that concept into something much darker.
They're applying it macroeconomically.
Right. They are suggesting that today, for the ultra-wealthy capital class, financial independence doesn't just mean freedom from a boss. It means they are fundamentally independent from the consequences of a struggling lower class.
That is the crux of the entire review. In historical Babylon, the rich and the poor were tethered together. If the poor starved, the rich suffered because the king would intervene and erase their ledgers, or the society would be overrun by invaders because there was no army.
So they needed each other.
The wealthy had a vested interest in the survival of the working class.
But today, because of globalization, tax shelters, and the adoption of artificial intelligence, that tether has been severed.
Exactly. If the American working class is crushed by housing costs, the modern billionaire doesn't face a debt jubilee. They don't face a collapse of their wealth because their wealth is diversified globally in equities, real estate portfolios, and automated systems.
Hello.
If a human worker can't afford to buy goods, the corporation replaces them with an AI that doesn't need a salary and the stock price goes up anyway. The modern wealthy are economically insulated from the societal fallout of their own hoarding.
They have achieved total escape velocity from the rest of society. So if the state is no longer balancing the scales like it did in ancient Babylon, and the wealthy are insulated from the consequences of a hollowed-out middle class, what is the reviewer's ultimate verdict on The Richest Man in Babylon?
The verdict is total systemic obsolescence. The reviewer isn't just complaining about rent being high. They have mapped the mechanics of the modern economy against the mechanics of the 1920s and ancient Mesopotamia and found that the core assumptions of the book no longer exist.
So the advice isn't just outdated, it's actively delusional.
The reviewer uses the phrase hardly actionable, if even applicable. They conclude that without a balancing force, the modern trend of wealth hoarding creates a permanent economic stagnation with, quote, no clear path for recourse.
You cannot budget your way out of systemic wage stagnation. You cannot cut enough coupons to outpace private equity firms buying up all the housing. And you certainly cannot invest your surplus when your job is handed over to a language model.
Therefore, the reviewer concludes, The Richest Man in Babylon should only be recommended for its historical context. It is a museum piece. It's a fascinating look at the economic optimism of 1927, but treating it as a modern survival guide is practically malpractice.
It is the ultimate snapshot of what people desperately wanted to believe right before reality came crashing down. Let's pull all of this together and recap the massive journey we just went on.
Sounds good.
We started with a book that offers universally praised, unassailable common sense advice. Ensure your income, don't procrastinate, live below your means, and invest the surplus.
The financial equivalent of eat less, move more. It works in a vacuum, but fails in friction.
Right. And then we deconstructed that advice through the analytical lens of a modern reviewer who argues that the socioeconomic friction has fundamentally altered the laws of financial physics.
We covered a lot.
We looked at how wage stagnation, the imminent threat of AI replacing labor, and the soaring costs of non-negotiable basic necessities like food, housing, and healthcare have mathematically eliminated the concept of a surplus for the average worker.
We spent a lot of time exploring the invisible scaffolding of trust. The requirement that lenders operate fairly, that wages sustain life, and that capital circulates in a healthy ecosystem.
Exactly.
We examine the reviewer's specific targeted argument that political and economic shifts dating back to the Reagan era have systematically shattered that trust, replacing it with a paranoid hoarding of wealth by the capital class.
And finally, we looked at the deep historical irony of Babylon itself. The realization that the ancient parables ignored the reality of state-mandated debt jubilees, highlighting the terrifying fact that today's ultra-wealthy are entirely insulated from the struggles of the working class.
Yeah.
The tether has been cut, turning a net worth of $0 from an optimistic starting line into an inescapable debt-fueled trap.
It requires a massive shift in how we consume financial information. We have to look past the comforting parables and examine the harsh mechanics of the system we actually live in.
So here is our challenge to you as we wrap up this deep dive. Tomorrow, when you open your phone and scroll through your feed, you're going to see someone offering you financial advice.
It's guaranteed.
It might be a slick influencer, it might be an article on a major news site, or it might be a friend quoting a vintage paperback. When someone confidently tells you to just invest your surplus or just side hustle your way to financial independence, I want you to stop and ask yourself, what invisible assumptions about the economy are they making?
Are they accounting for the mechanical realities of modern supply chains, institutional housing monopolies, and algorithmic labor replacement?
Or are they, entirely unknowingly, relying on the economic ghosts of 1927? We have to realize that the clean, simple answers we crave don't apply to the messy, structurally complex reality we are forced to navigate.
Absolutely true.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to mull over on your own. If the foundational rules of the richest man in Babylon are completely broken today because they relied on outdated models of societal trust and state intervention, what will the financial survival guides written in the 2020s actually say?
If the old rules are dead, what are the new rules?
Right. 100 years from now, in the year 2126, will readers look back at our current financial blogs and Substack newsletters as brilliant, adaptable foresight? Or will they view our modern strategies as the desperate, wildly inapplicable parables of a society standing on the brink of an entirely unrecognizable economic reality?
It's definitely something to keep in mind the next time someone offers you a piece of timeless common sense.
Until next time, keep diving deep.